All right, hi there everyone. Welcome back. This is the video for the sensory biology and behavioral ecology class, the first one. And so this video is another one of those 360-degree videos. So we're back in the video room here, so feel free to explore the space as I go through this. But to start off with, I wanted to talk about ecology. We've been talking about ecology for the last couple lectures, and I wanted to revisit the definition, which is this statement up here is the definition from your textbook. It says ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and with their environment. And so we've certainly been looking at that for the last couple lectures, especially with an emphasis on the environment. But I do like this additional definition in the yellow here, which is that ecology is about explaining patterns of species abundance and distribution. And you'll recognize the word patterns. That should evoke memories of our pattern and process framework that we use to look at biological questions. And we're certainly going to be trying to explain differences in abundance and distribution of species out in the world, and to do so, surprise, surprise, we'll be looking at processes or mechanisms that come from different scales. So again, we're looking at cross scales. Today we'll start off, we'll talk about individuals. We're going to be talking at the organismal level of ecology. I'll move into population and communities. I'll hand it over to Rika. We'll talk about ecosystems and we'll scale all the way up to biospheres. But today we're going to look at behavioral ecology, which is operating largely on the level of an individual. And so why do organisms have sensory systems in the first place? What's the advantage? Well, think about the talks we've had about the environment, that the environment is not uniform around the world. There's a lot of heterogeneity out there, both in the distribution of biological resources and in the gradients of abiotic factors, things like temperature and moisture. And so organisms need to be able to sense these differences in their external world so that they can make behavioral decisions on that. And so this video here is an example of that, where we've got a lizard out in the desert. And remember, lizards are ectotherms, so they're very sensitive to environmental temperatures. And so this lizard's out on these hot rocks, and you can sympathize with someone running on those hot rocks until the lizard makes it into the shade here, where it can relax and find a little thermal refuge. So this is a behavior that is certainly traversing this thermal gradient. Over here we've got an elk on a mountainside, and that elk certainly needs to be able to sense through vision or smell or through auditory cues its predator, the wolf, because the wolves there want to eat it. So there are clear advantages to organisms being able to sense their external world through some sort of sensory system. And so as a subfield of biology, there is a huge field looking at issues of behavioral ecology. There's a ton of studies out there that look at all sorts of organisms from around the animal kingdom. I'm just going to try to categorize a lot of those studies into two major groups. So one line of inquiry is looking at why a behavior occurs. Does that behavior in an organism help it survive and reproduce in its environment? So does it give it greater fitness? Does that behavior lead to greater fitness for that organism? And we call these ultimate causes. The question is, why does a behavior occur? Then there's a second line of inquiry, which is how does a behavior occur? We call these proximate causes. And so here you might be looking for, well, what is the actual stimulus that elicits a behavior? Is it light? Is it sound? Is it smell? What is the stimulus that elicits the behavior? And then on the other side, once the organism can sense that stimulus, what is the actual behavioral response that is mounted in response to that signal. So ultimate and proximate causes are two ways of looking at behavior. There's all sorts of examples of behavior around the animal kingdom. Here we've got a few examples. We've got a marine iguana here from the Galapagos Islands. And so this species will actually swim into the ocean and look for seaweed, but its ability to swim in these really cold waters depends on it being able to warm itself on these hot rocks in the sunlight. So a lot of behavioral decisions being made here regarding the thermal gradient. Here we have a frog as a predator trying to catch a dragonfly's prey. And here predator-prey behavior is very common in the animal kingdom. So the frog as a predator has a set of behaviors to try to catch the prey, and then the dragonfly as a prey has a subset of behaviors to try to avoid being eaten. So there's a back and forth going on in these predator-prey systems. And then over here's a really cool example of muskox up in the Arctic. And so they have a behavior when faced with predators where they will surround their young and make a protective ring around the calves so the predators can't get at them. And so what this underscores is how some behaviors are very complex and involve multiple individuals, often related individuals, but it's more of a group dynamic at that point. So there's just a ton of different behaviors out in all different types of species. When we look at behaviors, though, if we look at it in a very generalized sense, they depend on a sensory pathway, right? What does that mean? Well, for every behavior, there needs to be some sort of cue, right? So for instance, you might have the wolves out here, and the cue might be visual. The cue could be smell. The cue could be the sound of the howling that the wolves are making. Those cues then move through the environment. They're being transmitted and they're moving through the environment. So the cue, the signal depends on the environmental conditions. Eventually it gets to the receiver, in this case the elk. And so the elk needs to be able to detect those signals. It needs to either be able to see the wolf or smell it or hear it. Once it has picked up the signal, though, it then needs to be able to process that information and then do something with that information and elicit a behavior. So all of this is just in a very general sense of how important this sensory pathway is to getting to a behavior. And it underscores that this is not a really simple system. There are these different steps, and so they all have to work for behavior to be successful. And so these signals can be of many different types. So what I've got here are it's not an exhaustive list, but here's a list of different types of signals that sensory systems are based on. Some of them are familiar to us, things like visual and auditory cues. We as humans use those for sure, but some of them are less familiar. Things like geomagnetic fields. So some birds and some marine life use geomagnetic fields to help guide their migration. Humans don't use that as much, so it's not as familiar. But at any rate, different species use these different types of signals to sense their environment. And then over here, we have just a general list of behavioral categories. And so you'll notice that they all have a root of taxis in their title. And taxis comes from the Greek root, which in biology, we're talking about how organisms respond to an external stimulus. So for instance, phototaxis, right? We're looking at how organisms respond to light. Do they move towards the light or away from the light? Phototaxis. Chemotaxis is how organisms use chemical cues to trigger their behaviors. And then thermotaxis down here, some organisms are are using temperature gradients to guide their behavior. So there's a whole set of signals and a whole set of behavioral types there that are important. Now, it's important to just say off the top here that every species has its own set of sensory systems. Some of them are shared between species, but many of them are the combination is unique for every species, and we can't cover them all today. If you're interested in a lot of these behavioral strategies, I would invite you to look at some of the other courses in the bio department after Intro Bio. Behavioral ecology, we have a course in behavioral ecology, so you can certainly take that. If you're interested in the mechanisms of behavior, take a neurobiology course. And even my course, ecological physiology, we certainly look at how organisms interact with their physical environment. So I'm just going to do a very short survey of a couple types of senses here, but it's only scratching the surface. I'm going to talk about vision, and I'm going to talk about chemical cues. But if you're interested in more of that, please take some upper level courses. So what I'm going to start off with is light and vision. So using light as a cue is used by many different organisms. Some organisms don't have eyes like humans. They have photoreceptors that are a little bit more simple. So for instance, some invertebrates have pigment spots. And so they have the ability to sense light or dark, but they can't make out shapes. So an example would be something like a sea star, where on the tip of their arms they have these little pigment spots. So they can sense, for instance, if a fish is swimming above them and blocks the sunlight out, and that fish might be looking to nip its little tube feet off. So that's about all the sea star needs to do. It doesn't need to know shape, it just needs to know light or dark. In a lot of the arthropods, with terrestrial insects or crabs and shrimp, you start to get these compound eyes, which are many different photoreception units within the larger eye. And so they get all these independent stimuli in there. And so these types of eyes are good for seeing a very broad range or angle, and being able to pick up very quick motions, which would be advantageous to a flying insect like that. So these are different types of photoreception that are out there in the animal kingdom, but the type of eye that we are most familiar with is this vertebrate eye, right? This is the human form. And so light comes in through the pupil. The light goes through the lens, gets bent a little bit, and then that light hits the back walls of the eyeball where the retina is. And within the retina, there are photoreceptors. And there's typically two types of photoreceptors here that we're interested in. Rods, which pick up light versus dark or light intensity, but they're not very sensitive to color. Color gets picked up by cones. So color tells us a lot more about cones tell us about the color, but not so much about light intensity. So when you take these in conjunction with each other, they give a lot of information to the organism. And there's a great diversity in the form of the eye. Who knew? So here are 6 different eyes. We've got a cuttlefish here, we've got a lizard here, and we've got a bunch of mammalian eyes here. And you can see that there's a lot of diversity in the pupil, right? And in the centers of the eye. And so the question is, are these eyes all adapted to the type of lifestyle that these different organisms are living? And there's actually a really cool paper on this that looks specifically at the shape of the pupil. And so if we just look at the mammalian eyes, we've got a pupil that is round, one that is vertically extended, one that is horizontally extended, and then this one here is sort of in between round and vertical. And what they did in this paper is they sampled a whole bunch of different species, looked at their eyeball for the morphology and the shape, and then they categorized each of those species according to their lifestyle. So were they herbivores or were they predators? And within predators, were they active predators out there chasing down their prey, or were they ambush predators sitting in wait and then jumping out at their prey? And so they then took the four eye shapes and with these four rows categorize them according to their lifestyle. So I'm going to explain it to you, but why don't you pause the video, see if you can guess which one of these eyeball shapes goes with which row here. And each one of these dots is a different species. So take a second for that. Okay. So hopefully at this point you've made your first guess at that. Let me show you what the authors found. It's really cool. So here are the four types of eye shape, and here's how they broke out. So the vertical eye shape, that's basically like a cat eye. Those are species that are ambush predators, right? And so the most species are over here in this ambush column. And so for an ambush predator, they need to be able to gauge the distance of their prey. So if your cat is sitting there waiting for a bird and it wants to jump on that bird, as it jumps out, that bird's probably going to try to fly away. So the cat really needs to be able to gauge those distances in the vertical dimension. So vertical pupil shape correlates to an ambush predator. A circular pupil is more for an active predator. So predators that have to chase down their prey, and chasing down the prey is a dynamic process. The prey is going to move in any direction, so they need to be able to see sort of in a fuller view. So that is an active predator. And then the horizontal pupil was found in the herbivores, right? Because think about a herbivore. Herbivore is putting its head down, grazing down onto the plants, and it needs to be able to scan its horizon for any potential predators that are gonna come out and get it. So having this horizontal pupil gives it acuity and resolution along the horizontal plane, and so that's a goat eye there, which is a goat is a classic herbivore. So these are really cool correlations made to the lifestyle of the organism. So it does seem like the design of the eye, especially this pupil shape, does seem to correlate with a biological lifestyle or function. A similar study kind of goes hand in hand with this, but it's looking just at lizards. So a different taxonomic group, but they also looked at the characteristics of the eye to see if they correlated with their lifestyle. So here they looked at lizards that are all dragon lizards, so closely related lizards. They looked at 6 species. Some of them were rock dwelling, so they were up on top of the rock, and some of them lived in burrows. And so they categorized 3 versus 3, and then they looked at the eyes to see if there were differences in the type of eyes that these species had. And so they went a little more in depth into the morphology here of the eye and the anatomy. So they looked at the retina in the eye, and then they looked at the photoreceptors, the distribution of photoreceptors, and then the nerve cells related to the photoreceptors. So looking at this anatomy to see if they were different between burrows and on top of rocks. And here's what they found. The lizards and the burrows had more photoreceptors and more neurons related to those photoreceptors than the species that lived on the rocks. And then if they did a test to see how small their spatial vision, or how acute their spatial vision was, and the burrow species had greater spatial acuity, meaning that they could see smaller objects than the ones on the rock. And so there's clear differences between the two lifestyles in the anatomy of the eye. What the actual advantage is from an ecological point of view still need to be followed up on. The authors didn't look explicitly on what these differences mean to the organism in an ecological sense. They could speculate that the organisms in the burrows needed to see smaller objects underground, but this still needs to follow up with it. Nevertheless, it is when taken together with the mammalian study, it shows that the morphology of these eyeballs are related and correlate with the environment and the lifestyle that the organism is living. So there's an interesting pattern there, both in mammals and in reptiles.